I never thought betrayal would come from the people I loved most. But that afternoon, it stood in front of me like a cold slap. My son and his wife were laughing in my living room, talking about plans I hadn't been invited into. The decisions had already been made, and I was simply there as a bystander, a guest in a home that was still legally mine. I sat there on the edge of the couch, trying to keep my hands steady. But inside, I felt small, almost invisible. The words coming out of my daughter-in-law's mouth stung more than she probably realized, or maybe she did realize. And that was the point. She spoke with the kind of certainty that left no room for me. My role was being reduced, trimmed down to nothing more than a name on a deed or a source of money. It's hard to describe what humiliation feels like in real time. It's not just embarrassment, it's a tightening in your chest, a burning in your stomach, a hollow ringing in your ears as you realize the people who should protect you have placed you at the bottom of their list. I remember looking at my son, searching for some glimmer of recognition in his face, hoping he would soften the blow. But he just sat there, nodding along, his silence cutting me even deeper. My mind couldn't help but flash back to all the years I spent raising him after his father passed away. I remembered those early mornings when I worked 2 jobs, slipping out of the house at dawn so he could have new sneakers for basketball. I remembered the nights I stayed up late ironing his shirts before school, even when my body begged for rest. There was the time I sold my own wedding jewelry to pay for his college textbooks because I believed so deeply in his future. And now, here I was, being treated like a relic from another era, someone to be managed rather than cherished. The contrast was almost unbearable. I had poured every ounce of myself into giving him a stable life, and now he let his wife speak over me as if my words carried no weight at all. I felt the humiliation rise in me like a tide. They were already mapping out rooms in the house, speaking casually about where they would place furniture, while suggesting that perhaps I should consider taking the smallest space for convenience. Convenience for whom? Certainly not for me. It was clear I wasn't part of the vision they had for their future. I was just a leftover piece they couldn't quite discard, but could quietly tuck away where I wouldn't bother anyone. There was a moment where I wanted to scream, to slam my hand down on the table and remind them who I was and everything I had done. But instead, I sat there in silence, letting their words wash over me, tasting the bitterness of it all. Because in that silence, something inside me began to shift. I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding or a slip of the tongue. This was the first clear sign of something much deeper. As I sat quietly, watching my son and his wife dream aloud about a future built on what was mine, I felt a strange calmness settle over me. It wasn't acceptance, it was clarity. I finally saw them for who they were, or at least for who they had become. And with that realization came a question that has haunted me ever since. How far would they go? That was the day I understood the betrayal wasn't just about that one conversation or that one humiliation. It was the beginning of a story I never expected to live through, a story of trust broken, of lines crossed, and of a mother who would have to learn the hardest lesson of her life. I didn't know the full extent of it yet, but I knew enough. This wasn't an isolated moment. This was the first crack in the surface, and I was about to see how wide it could split. Most mornings in those days started quietly. I'd sit by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sparrow tapping at the glass. It was a simple rhythm, one that reminded me of the life I'd shared with my husband. He used to tease me about needing my sunrise coffee before I could face the world. Sometimes I still catch myself glancing at the empty chair across the table, as if expecting him to be there, tapping his spoon against the mug the way he always did. Life seemed steady on the surface. I cooked my own meals, tended the small garden he and I once planted together, and kept myself busy with crosswords and church activities. Outwardly, it was the quiet retirement many people dream about. But under that quiet, small shifts were happening. Changes so subtle at first that I almost convinced myself they were nothing at all. It began with little things. My daughter-in-law suggesting I let her handle the grocery shopping, insisting that it would save me the trouble. At first, it felt kind. I told myself it was just her way of showing she cared. Then, she began organizing my pantry, moving things into labeled containers, even replacing brands I had always used with her own choices. When I noticed, I brushed it off. She's just being helpful, I told myself, even as I felt my home becoming less my own. Then came the bills. My son suggested I let him streamline them through his online accounts. He said it would be safer, easier, less for me to manage. Again, I wanted to see it as love him stepping in to protect me. But soon I realized I didn't recognize the numbers in my own statements. There were transactions I never made, subscriptions I never signed up for. I questioned it once, but the explanation came quickly, wrapped in that tone people use when they think you shouldn't worry. And against my better judgment, I let it slide. It was easier to tell myself they were just trying to help. After all, hadn't I spent decades sacrificing for my son? Maybe this was my time to lean on him. Maybe I was the one resisting change, holding too tightly to the way things had been. That's what I repeated to myself when the unease grew too loud. But I couldn't ignore the way my daughter-in-law began speaking about my life as though it were hers to arrange. She would talk about the house in ways that unsettled me. What updates should be made, which rooms should be rearranged, how convenient it would be to consolidate certain accounts. Sometimes she said it right in front of me, as if my opinion were unnecessary. My son, sitting quietly beside her, rarely disagreed. His silence spoke volumes. It's strange how control slips away, not in a single dramatic moment, but piece by piece. A pantry reorganized, a bill rerouted, a decision made without asking. At first, it feels like a kindness, then like a convenience, and before long you realize you're standing in a life where your voice doesn't carry. I told myself I was overreacting, that families help each other, that I should be grateful for their involvement. But late at night, lying awake in my quiet bedroom, I felt the weight of something darker. These weren't random acts of care. They were steps carefully measured, carefully planned towards something I couldn't yet name. And deep down, I knew these cracks in the surface weren't going to close. They were spreading, widening, pulling apart the life I thought I still controlled. And what I would discover next would prove my fears weren't just in my head, they were only the beginning. It was a Saturday afternoon when I decided to sit down with my bank statements. I hadn't done it in a while, trusting that my son was streamlining things for me. But something in my gut told me to look for myself. I carried the stack of envelopes into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and started to read. At first, it was just numbers, ordinary expenses, familiar bills. But then, tucked between the pages, I saw charges that didn't belong. A high-end furniture store in the city, a weekend stay at a resort I'd never visited, designer clothing boutiques with names I'd never even heard of. each one bold as day, all tied back to my accounts. My hands trembled as I traced the numbers with my finger. 5,000 here, 1,200 there. Another charge for almost 3,000. These weren't mistakes, they were deliberate. Someone was draining what I had worked my entire life to build, and they were doing it with confidence, as though I'd never notice. At first, my heart broke. I thought of my son, the boy I once carried on my hip, who I swore I would protect from every storm. I thought of the years of double shifts, of sitting at the kitchen table with coupons spread across the surface just to stretch every dollar. Every sacrifice had been for him. And now, staring at those statements, I felt the crushing weight of betrayal. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to tell myself there had to be some mistake. But as I flipped through page after page, the truth became impossible to deny. It wasn't just random charges, it was a pattern, a steady siphoning of money, increasing in boldness over time. And then I saw it a transfer, not to a store or a credit card, but directly into a separate account. Not mine. Not one I had ever opened. It was under my son's name, but I knew in my heart whose idea it had been. My daughter-in-law. She was clever, calculated, the kind of person who smiled sweetly while arranging things exactly the way she wanted them. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just overspending or irresponsibility. This was a plan. They weren't just borrowing money, they were setting up an entirely new foundation for themselves. Brick by brick, built on what was mine. And worse, they hadn't planned to stop. As I pieced it together, the memories came back sharper. Her insistence on handling the groceries, her eagerness to reroute the bills, her casual talk about consolidating assets and future planning. I had thought it was controlling, even disrespectful, but now I understood it was strategic. Each little intrusion had been a rehearsal, a test, leading to this. For a moment, anger consumed me. I wanted to storm into their house, slam those statements down on the table, and demand answers. But almost as quickly, another feeling took hold: clarity. If I confronted them now, they would have excuses ready, smooth words to make me doubt myself. They would spin the story until I looked unreasonable, maybe even unstable. No, I couldn't hand them that chance. This wasn't the time for shouting. This was the time for silence, for planning. I folded the statements carefully and placed them back in their envelopes. My heart was still pounding, but my hands were steady now. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer just a grieving widow, easy to push aside. I was a woman who had seen the truth and who was ready to act. The betrayal was deeper than I had ever imagined, but I wasn't powerless. I knew I couldn't undo what they had already taken, but I could stop what was coming next. And in that moment, I promised myself that I would. What they didn't know, what they would never see coming, was that I wasn't going to confront them yet. I would wait. I would watch. And I would prepare. Because if they thought I was finished, they were wrong. The real story was only beginning. The day I uncovered those transfers, something inside me shifted. Up until then, I had been the quiet mother, the widow who didn't want to make waves. But once I saw how far they had already gone, I knew silence alone wouldn't protect me. I had to change. I began with the simplest step: writing everything down. I pulled out a notebook from the drawer where I used to keep grocery lists and lesson plans from my teaching days. Every charge, every strange withdrawal, every oversight I had brushed off, I wrote it all in careful handwriting, line by line. Old habits returned easily. After 30 years in a classroom, I knew how to document things so that no one could argue with them later. Next, I started gathering proof. I made copies of bank statements, tucked them into folders, and hid them where I knew no one would think to look inside the sleeves of old cookbooks, at the back of my closet behind winter coats. I told myself it wasn't paranoia, it was protection. If they could manipulate accounts, who was to say they wouldn't try to twist the story once they realized I had caught on? At the same time, I played my part. I let my daughter-in-law suggest changes with that rehearsed smile of hers, and I nodded as though I agreed. I let my son believe I trusted him to handle my bills. To them, I was still the mother who could be gently pushed aside. They had no idea I was keeping track of every move. As the weeks went on, their pressure grew. My daughter-in-law began floating the idea that maybe I should consider moving into a smaller place for my own comfort. She spoke about it casually, as though it were a passing thought, but I heard the edge underneath. My son echoed her, suggesting it would ease my responsibilities. They painted it as care, but I knew better. They were circling, closing in. That's when I reached out quietly to someone I trusted, a lawyer recommended by a friend from church. I told him everything, my suspicions, the evidence, the changes in my household. He didn't laugh it off, didn't call me dramatic. He nodded, took notes, and reminded me of something I had almost forgotten: the law was still on my side. He explained steps I could take, things I could secure now before anyone tried to force my hand. Walking out of his office that day, I felt steadier than I had in months. For the first time since my husband passed, I wasn't just surviving, I was protecting myself, but I kept that strength quiet. I still smiled when my son came by, still thanked my daughter-in-law when she brought groceries. I let them believe their plan was working. Inside, though, I was sharper than I had ever been. Every time they dropped a hint about the house or my finances, I filed it away, added it to my notes. Every polite smile I returned was another layer of armor. I knew a storm was coming, and I wasn't naive enough to think it would pass me by. But this time, I wouldn't be standing there unprepared. I wasn't the fragile woman they thought I was. I was ready, and when the moment came to confront them, I would have everything I needed, not just my voice, but the proof, the clarity, and the strength they never imagined I still had. The moment I had been waiting for finally came. They called me into the living room one evening, their voices carrying that false sweetness I had grown used to. My daughter-in-law started the conversation, her words dripping with concern about my future comfort. She painted a picture of how much easier life would be if I moved out of the house, how seamless it would be if she and my son took over the bigger responsibilities. My son sat next to her, nodding, his silence doing the dirty work of agreement. I sat quietly, hands folded, letting their words build like a wave crashing toward me. They thought I would bend under the pressure, that I would feel cornered. What they didn't know was that I had been waiting for this exact moment. She spoke about bills piling up, about repairs the house supposedly needed, about how it was only sensible to consolidate everything in their names. I listened, calm, even as my heart raced. And then, when the air was thick with their certainty, I leaned back and opened the folder I had carried in. I placed it on the table, sliding the papers across the surface. Bank statements, copies of transfers, receipts from stores I had never set foot in. Every line highlighted, every number circled in red. Their eyes flicked down, confusion giving way to panic. I told them, in the calmest voice I could manage, that I knew. I knew about the accounts, the transfers, the furniture I had never seen, the vacations I had never taken. And then I revealed the part that broke whatever mask they had left. I told them I had already spoken to a lawyer, that every detail was documented, that if they tried to deny it, they would be standing not just against me, but against the law. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. My son's face drained of color, and he looked down at his hands like a boy caught stealing. My daughter-in-law tried to force a smile, but it faltered as her eyes darted across the evidence. She stammered, searching for an excuse, but there was no room left for her performance. And then came the twist. The final piece I had saved for last. I told them I had already moved part of my savings into protected accounts they couldn't touch. I had changed passwords, closed loopholes, locked every door they thought they had left open. For weeks, they had believed they were winning. In truth, I had been 2 steps ahead. The shift in the room was almost physical. Where they once sat taller, pressing their case with confidence, now they seemed smaller, shrinking into themselves. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply sat there, calm, steady, and unmovable, while they realized their plan had collapsed. For once, I wasn't the one silenced. They were, and in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: power. Not the power to control others, but the power to protect myself, to stand firmly in the truth without fear. That night, I walked away from the table, knowing the balance had shifted. The story they thought they were writing had ended, and mine had just begun. In the days that followed that confrontation, the air in my home felt different, quieter, lighter. My daughter-in-law stopped visiting altogether. The confident smile she once wore so easily had vanished, replaced by silence that spoke louder than any excuse she might have tried. I knew she had lost the power she thought she held over me, and for someone like her, that was the deepest cut of all. My son, though, lingered. He called me often, sometimes stopping by, but his presence felt heavy with guilt. He struggled to look me in the eye, his words stumbling as he tried to explain what had happened, as if explanations could erase the choices he had made. I could see in his face the boy I had raised, the boy who once held my hand crossing the street, the boy I had believed would grow into a man of integrity. That boy was still there, buried under years of poor decisions and weak silences. It hurt to see him wrestle with his shame, but I didn't let that shame dictate my peace. I had carried the weight of other people's needs for far too long. This time, I chose to carry only my own dignity. I told him, gently but firmly, that healing was his work to do. I would no longer sacrifice myself to cover his mistakes. Strangely, I began to notice love and kindness in places I had overlooked before. My neighbors, who waved when I passed them on morning walks, started stopping for conversations. The widow across the street invited me to her book club, and for the first time in years, I sat in a circle of women, laughing over coffee and pastries. A young family down the block brought me fresh tomatoes from their garden, their children giggling as they carried the basket to my porch. These small gestures reminded me that family isn't only about blood. Sometimes family is found in the people who choose to stand beside you, not because they want something, but because they care. That realization soothed the ache my son and his wife had left in me. I also learned to enjoy my own company again. I planted flowers in the yard, the same ones my husband had loved, and each morning I walked outside to water them felt like a small act of victory. Not victory over my son or his wife, but victory over the fear that I had no place in the world without their approval. Looking back, I realized the greatest lesson wasn't about betrayal, it was about boundaries. Love is powerful, but without boundaries, love can be twisted into chains. I had mistaken sacrifice for devotion, silence for peace. What I know now is that true love, even for family, doesn't ask you to erase yourself. It respects you. It honors you. So if you are listening to this and you feel the weight of being dismissed, manipulated, or used, I want you to know this. You are allowed to draw the line. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to protect what you've built, whether that's your money, your home, or your peace of mind. That doesn't make you selfish. That makes you strong. Today, I sit in my home with a renewed sense of self. My son still calls, and though our relationship is complicated, I answer with grace, but also with caution. My daughter-in-law remains distant, and that is her choice. As for me, I've chosen something better than resentment. I've chosen freedom. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been in a place where you had to reclaim your boundaries, I'd love to hear it. Share your story in the comments, because your voice matters too. And if my experience resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. Together, we can remind each other that dignity is worth protecting.